Hello, everyone, and welcome. I'm excited to be here for another fantastic interview. Today, I'm happy to talk to Maggie Wilderotter, an unbelievably accomplished CEO and board member multiple times over. But Maggie, why don't you share a little bit about your background?
Well, thanks, Brian, and it's great to be with everyone. I have had the privilege to sit on 57 corporate boards in my career. 37 public, the balance private. Of the 37 that are public that I've been on, 17 were private when I started, so I've seen a lot of private to public transactions. I went on my first corporate board at 28 years old. No one told me I couldn't do it.
And so you did it.
And I was in the cable television industry, working at a data processing and management information systems company. And my customers were all the cable operators and the network and programmers as well. And so I needed to get to meet senior level members of these cable operations in order to get the business. So what I did is I would set meetings up or be at places where I could get to know those folks. And one of the folks that I got to know very well was Steve Dodge, who was the CEO of American Cable Systems, which was headquartered in Boston at the time. And after about 6 months of he and his company using our services and me providing the entrees to what he would need for them to be successful, he said to me, we're private as a company, but I'd really love for you to consider joining my board. And I was, again, 28 years old, and I said, sure. Well, what does that mean? One of those kind of conversations. But the great thing is I joined the board. It was small. We had five board members. We were private. 6 months after I joined the board, we took the company public. And 6 months after that, we sold the company. So by 29, I had done a private board, a public board, and had an M&A transaction.
Checked it all off.
And I made a fair amount of money. So I said, I like this gig. I think I'm going to do it again.
That's great.
So that's sort of how my board service started.
And you were a CEO as well?
At the time, I was a senior vice president at a company. But I was a CEO of a startup for 7 years. And I was a CEO of a Fortune 500 for 12 in my career.
So over the course of all of those boards, how has the role of the board evolved?
Well, board service used to be a little bit like the Wizard of Oz with the wizard behind the curtain, and no one really had any visibility to what boards actually did. And there were really no stakeholder activists for many, many years. That's more of a recent phenomenon over the last probably 8-9 years. We've seen a lot more stakeholder engagement. And I think because of that, the work has become more transparent on the part of the board members. Because
Is that a good thing?
I think it is. I think it's important for us to remember that we have constituents. We've got folks that, invest a lot of money in the companies, that we have the advocacy to sit on these boards and to do the right things on behalf of those shareholders. So to keep them up to date on what we're doing, I think is important. So when I think about 2024, I think about a handful of priorities that the boards are focused on today. And I'm talking really, it doesn't matter if it's private or public. They're all focused pretty much in the same area. First is on understanding and knowing your stakeholders. And those are key employees, management, shareholders, could be partners, could be industry players, but that constituency of stakeholders that focus on the companies are people that the board members need to know who they are and what their expectations are. I'd say the second thing is to engage with management at the CEO level, and also what I call the executive leadership team, which is the direct reports to that CEO. And to make sure that we understand who they are, what they do, what their capabilities are, because we also have to look at CEO succession. And many times it comes from that executive leadership team. You might have one or two viable candidates. And then the third is you really are scanning the horizon for opportunities, for threats. You're also looking at trends that can affect the company. And so you want to be outside in as much as you're inside out. And so when I think about the hot topics, Some of it we call alphabet soup these days, like DEI. You have environment, social, and governance, which is ESG. You've got AI for artificial intelligence, and then you have things like succession and activism as well. And so I think when I think about sort of the big hot topics, they're the topics underneath the umbrella of the priorities.
And how has board's role around oversight of risk changed over the course of the last 10 years or even the last 5 years?
Yeah. Well, I think we have to position our companies to understand what the risks are and then to try to proactively mitigate those risks before they become detrimental to the company or to any of the stakeholders of the company. And when I think about risk, you want to think 5 to 10 years out as a board member. You're not thinking just what's the risk that might happen this year. You're actually trying to prepare the company to make sure that you have a mitigation plan for risk that's multi-year. And I also think your investors are thinking out 5 to 10 years, just like you are, to make sure that there's a viability and that you can reduce the risk environment. And that requires, too, to have the right talent in the right seats. One of the biggest risks is when you do leadership changes. Another risk might be an acquisition that you might do that changes the course of where the company is. So from a risk perspective, we're always looking at, well, what are all the risks that could happen to the company? And then do we have the right strategies in place to mitigate them?
And how well prepared do you think boards are around new risks like AI, for example, which risk and opportunity, but it's got to fall into the risk category from a board's perspective, I'd assume?
I think it depends on the company, right? I think it also depends on the business you're in, and it depends on the vulnerabilities that company might have to something like AI. But I think we're still in the early days of what artificial intelligence can do and what it can't do. And I think as board members, we have to stay up to speed on how that evolves and make sure that the company is staying up to speed on how it evolves and that the CEO is communicating to the board if they use AI, how they're using it, and what are they putting in place when they do use it to make sure you try to mitigate as much risk as possible.
And then as you've seen, have you seen the way that companies think about and communicate risk or the frameworks by which they look at it? Has that evolved too over the last few years?
Yeah, I do think so. And I think it has to be, first of all, the 80-20. You only want to have the major risks from a board perspective that you're focused on, because every day are risks, right? You're going to have those. But kind of the main risks that can really derail the company. And I also think that you should have risk mitigation plans in place that the leadership team with the board put in place. And then the board can monitor the progress on that risk mitigation over quarters. And I've seen that be pretty effective when you have groups, when you bring those groups together. And a lot of times we'll do that over a strategy retreat where you have a couple days together. Instead of people looking at their watches and running for planes, that it gives you a chance to really coalesce around what are the right opportunities, what are the right strategies for those opportunities, and how do you calculate the risks and manage them.
Perfect, makes sense. You talked a little bit about talent. I know you're passionate about talent and evolving talented companies.
Yep.
The board's role is in part or primarily to hire and fire the CEO.
Yep.
But you talked about succession planning, and how do you think about evaluating or better understanding the talent that exists kind of across the ELT, as you called it out?
Well, I think you have to look at their experience level, their tenure, how they interact with each other, how they interact with the board, how do they interact with the talent that works for them and with them. And I also, when we watch the presentations that are given by these executive leaders in the company, we want to know how they think about taking their business to the next level. So a lot of it is dialogue, right, that you're having with board members. If you're an executive, you're presenting, but it's also a conversation. And death by PowerPoint is not acceptable. It should be a couple slides that we've all looked at ahead of time And then what I try to do with the boards that I serve on and where I chair boards is talk about, give me a slide of 5 of the top questions that you'd like input or insights from the board on what you're working on. And to try to keep the discussion in the boardroom around those questions. And I think that is very helpful that,
up level from the PowerPoint decks.
That's right. You're just not downloading to people, you're having a discussion.
And how active is the conversation in the boardroom around succession planning? I assume it depends on company and there's other factors there, but is it an annual discussion that happens in most of your boards and maybe more frequently?
Yes, and I also think it has to do with the tenure of your CEO.
Sure.
Or possibly the age of your CEO. Sure. And if your CEO is doing well and it's a couple of years into the job, the succession it's still a priority, but it's really more about how do we continue to help this person be successful and grow.
Or in a just-in-case situation, I
Yeah, we call that the hit by the bus scenario, right? So if the CEO gets hit by a bus, what's the emergency? What's the emergency succession plan? And that typically would be possibly a president or a COO of a company in an acting role.
Sure.
Or it could be a board member that is declared that hit by the bus if something happens.
I feel like as board members become a little bit younger in tenure as well, I assume that appears to be something that happens in a more frequent basis maybe today than it did years ago.
It did. Because you really have term limits now.
Sure.
And most of them are somewhere around 8 to 12 years. That's the rule of thumb that I actually use when I join boards. And I'm upfront about it right up front that I'm going to be on this board probably 8 to 12 years. And the reason why I use a 4-year gap is if a company's in trouble, I'm not going to leave. I'll stay through getting through the trouble because I don't want to signal that I've lost faith in the company either. But if a company's doing well, that 8 to 9 year level, I'll move on and go do something else.
And then what does a good CEO succession planning process look like?
Well, I think it starts with...
Bring us behind that curtain.
Yeah, behind the curtain. I think it starts with the executive sessions that the board has after each meeting. I mean, you're really discussing not just the CEO's performance, but the people that work for that CEO, and possibly one level down, what we call the high potentials.
Sure.
And I know as a board member, I try to have a meal at least twice a year with every executive leadership team member, where you're not in an office, where someone's not sitting behind a desk and somebody's standing up and presenting, where you're equals and you're eating, right? So you get to know who they are, not what they do. And I want to know who they are first, because what they do will be determined on what's inside them, right? So I try to do that. And I also try to go down to the high potentials in the company. And I think, as you know, I've been a big advocate for women and minorities getting promoted in companies to senior executive positions as well, and on boards.
Yeah. And creates a better or broader set of people to pull from, obviously.
That's right.
And when a CEO succession process doesn't go well or goes sideways, why would that be the case?
Sometimes the company actually outgrows the CEO if they're growing very rapidly.
Okay. Some of your fast growth pre-public company examples.
Yes.
Yeah.
And you'll have that too, even with some public companies, especially in tech, right? Where you might have a situation where the company had when you hired the leader, the company was a couple $100 million in revenue. And then the company starts to grow exponentially and your CEO's never seen anything above, 500 million and the company's now at 3 billion, right? Because scale is a very different way to run businesses than being able to put your arms around everything yourself. And I think knowing what you need when you need it, and does your company really have the time to wait for that person to grow into it, are some of the questions that board members have to ask. And the other thing is on board succession as well. There's nobody in charge on a board.
Yeah.
Right? We're all equals. It's different, at least we can hire and fire the CEO.
There is governance there.
There is governance. There's actually a path.
Yes.
Where in the boardroom, everybody's an equal. So you really have to get to a consensus level which sometimes can take 3 or 4 meetings before you can actually make specific decisions on succession on the board.
And so when a succession plan goes well, so take that example, how do you also think about ways to mitigate or set that person up for success?
Well, I think,
mitigate risk or set the person up for success.
When you're talking about new board members?
Oh, no, so for the CEO. So when you bring in the new CEO, you think you got it right.
Yep.
How do you set them up for success, or how do you think about reducing risk in that transition?
Well, I think first and foremost, you want to make sure that the board and that CEO are aligned on what are the priorities for the next 6 months, right? You want to look out longer than that over time, but for a new CEO, what's front and center for that CEO over a 6-month window? And they walk in the door, they got to get to know the team, they got to assess that team. That's usually a number 1 priority, to have the CEO give the board his or her assessment of the team, of the industry, of what he or she are hearing from customers. If there are partners in the portfolio of that company itself, what the partners are thinking. So the first 6 months are kind of a listening and learning tour, as well as some quick hits, I would call them, on key decisions that have to get made. And the number 1 priority is to focus on making the numbers, right? And bringing in the business, right?
Get the basics right.
Get the basics right.
And so one of the things that you told me in a prior conversation was about sometimes a role that you will play in mentoring CEOs or high potential individuals who could fill in that seat. Just for people who are there watching, what does that look like?
The mentor process?
Yeah.
Well, I think first of all, it's building trust, right? For any situation, you want to get to know somebody for who they are. And I want them to get to know me for who I am, not just what I've done. And then I think there's an agreement that you want to get to on what are the top priorities and how can I personally be helpful to that person in achieving those objectives? How could the board be helpful? And in addition, what does that person feel that he or she needs in order to be successful? And what kind of dialogue or touch base with the board should take place in this, really tough environment of the first 6 months of any CEO in a new job.
Yeah.
Because you want them to spend the majority of the time getting good at the job, not getting good at presenting to us.
To you. Yeah.
Right.
Good. Helpful.
Yeah.
On the board side, you talked about obviously being a huge advocate of adding new and different types of people to boards, elements of diversity. But if you take a step back and just what's your advice to people who are aspiring board members or new board members? What advice do you give to them?
Well, I think first of all, spend the first couple meetings listening and learning. My grandmother used to say, God gave you 2 ears and 1 mouth to listen twice as much as you talk. And I think for new people, they should listen more.
Sure.
And watch the dynamic. Who are the de facto leaders in the boardroom on what topics? Maybe make some notes and write down some questions as the board is going through the work of the board to get maybe more feedback or context on how things evolve to that level. So I think in the first couple meetings, new board members should lean back a bit, get a lay of the land, get a sense for who the de facto leaders are, understand what the discussion and dialogue looks like. And then maybe make a list of questions that you could follow up with other board members. One of the other things that I've done on different boards, and even when I ran Frontier Communications, which was a Fortune 500 when I ran it, is we would buddy up a new board member with an existing seasoned board member and did a board buddy program. So for the first 12 months, that
kind of onboarding that board member.
That's exactly right. And just a resource that they could go to for questions if they don't want to, it's hard to get to know everybody, but to get to know one board member well enough that you build that established relationship and you can ask anything. So
cool. 2 rapid fire questions for you.
Okay.
To close things out. What's the biggest risk you've ever taken, Maggie?
marrying my junior high school sweetheart.
All right.
Who I've been married to for 47 years, so it was a good risk.
All right, that's good.
Yeah, so love him to death as much today as I did the day I met him.
Perfect.
Sometimes it's better to be lucky than smart.
I love jumping into the personal side as well. And then you talked about, of the 50 plus boards that you've been on, what's your advice to people who want to get on their first board? And you talked your story about seemed like hustle and grit, but what's your advice to others?
Well, I think you need to be intentional. My advice would be, it's not a magic wand theory. If you sit there and wait for the magic wand, you will never get on a board. So I would say you write down and be real honest with yourself of what your skills and capabilities are. Decide how that could be applied to which industries. Make an intentional list of 5 or 6 companies in that industry that you admire. Take a look at who their directors are today, especially if they're public, it's public information. And if there's anybody with a 7 handle in their age, they're going to get replaced soon. So that will provide for openings. Or someone who's been on the board for more than 15 years could also provide an opening. So you almost have to do what I call some, shadow research to kind of see where those opportunities might come up. And if there's a company that's just refreshed 3 or 4 board members, they're probably not going to do anything for several years. So you want to try to establish and identify those opportunity sets.
Strategic, intentional, do your homework. I'm
Absolutely.
not surprised to hear that as the advice. Well, thank you, Maggie. I totally enjoyed the conversation. That was awesome, and I hope everyone else enjoyed it as much as I did.
And me too. And it's always great with Brian because he's always well prepared.
Thank you, Maggie. Thanks, everyone.